Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Ann Edwards. I'm a NASA Datanaut and member of the Oxford Space Initiative. Professionally, I work as an innovation catalyst, helping organizations and communities harness the power of dynamic ecosystems to meet their own goals. This Smart Space session at Said Business School is the first in the second series. The topic today is how social sciences can and must put humans back into discussions and planning for space commerce and governance. Engineering and political will, coupled with humanity's irrepressible urge to explore, has created unprecedented opportunities in space. How quickly we support social sciences and the research required will determine how equitable and desirable that future is. I'd like to introduce two amazing guests today. Karl Schroeder, science fiction author and Foresight practitioner. Hello, Karl. And Guy-Philippe Goldstein, cyber defense expert and also an author. Both of my guests work in the realm of the future professionally, and they have different frameworks to approach that, and that's part of why we're here today. I've enlisted them to talk about soft skills, how social sciences in particular can help us talk about capacity, resilience, frameworks, addressing and preparing for unknowns. In other words, to imagine, and why that is urgent, why it's urgent to talk about the social sciences part of our shared space future. Today's discussion assumes a few things as a starting point. One, that human activity will increase in near space. And by near space, I mean from Earth to Mars. That the achievement of those known goals are absolutely happening and achievable. So the engineering and the math and even the political will, we're going to assume that much of that is a given for this conversation. And the third assumption is that we as a planet, as a species, and certainly as governments, are not asking enough of the other questions about all the other human factors that affect the outcomes in near and future space, and why we have skills and resources and talent pools that are not tapped well enough. So there's a lot to get to, and the way this is going to go, I'm going to ask my guests some questions. They're fairly dense questions, and I'm going to encourage them to have some back and forth, and we are going to save some time at the end to take audience questions. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right on in. So I will start, and I will throw it first to Karl. What do you see as some of the critical gaps in those human soft skills in social sciences research and recognized expertise, not just existing research, that we need to build a sustainable, equitable space future?
I'm very concerned about issues around governance, both corporate governance and governance of individuals and groups that are off planet. We sort of conceive of them as branch plants in a way right now, where we send up our orders and they follow. But we are rapidly going to enter into a realm where autonomy is required. We're dealing with not just a new environment, but a new kind of environment. And I'm not sure that the models that we have here on Earth for governance and coordination will really extend well. What are your thoughts on that, Guy-Philippe?
Well, I would actually start on that very important point that you mentioned of governance. And to me, it's a critical one. I would say, to some extent, that space, as we're discussing about, is actually, to a large extent, a man-made environment, because we are freeing up things in space that didn't exist. We're freeing up capabilities in space that never were there. We're building up that environment, that space. And actually, for me, it's a bit of a help because it feels a bit like cyber, which is also a man-made environment. And just to perhaps go on what you see on governments, to me, there are a couple of tools perhaps that can be helpful to try to get to the objective that Laura has set us, that is to build a sustainable, equitable space future. I mean, there are lots of things around seeing the world. And if I go back to say to Spinoza and the ethics in a subspecie aeternitatis way, that is to look at all the things that could happen on a long-term view, wherever you put that long term, say at least 20, 30 years from now. Mm-hmm. And also to see at all the things that you could do long term, but also kind of in a universal way, and which is where things get much messier actually, because you need to think about all the impacts that you could have. And the last point on that, but this is actually more the cyber analyst who's talking than the fiction writer. When we're talking about impacts, actually measuring stuff, and there are many different ways, especially if you're thinking about sustainable, equitable world, where you can actually today assess impacts, so that requires a bit of having a sort of ethical framework, by the way. But because you could assess impacts and just have your pure how much profits you're going to make, or how much loss you may incur to other type of population. And actually doing that type of calculus and moving it to the standard of cost that you could pick up. Are you going to try to assess your most negative cost? All the bad stuff that you could do. Are you doing what you think are positive things? Because there's always side effects and so forth. If you start building up all that and trying to cost that, and again looking that on the long-term value and kind of in a universal frame, like all the things that could happen on Earth, because at the end of the day, the question sustainable, equitable is for human beings, then maybe you have a couple of frameworks here that can help you get through. At least, okay, I don't know, what do you think about all that?
So the specific expertise that I heard you call out, though, which I completely agree with, is ethics. I'd like your help in identifying some of the specific fields, right? You both, again, make your living holding abstract ecosystems of near and far future potentialities in your heads and in your writing. I'm interested in who should be at the table that isn't.
Oh, well, that's a really good question. And I'll give an example of how broad this can be. The current plan for the Starlink constellation is for ultimately there to be 30,000 satellites in orbit. This will, after sunset and before dawn, essentially reconfigure the constellations. The stars will not look the same anymore. When you begin to contemplate building very large systems in space, for instance, space colonies somewhere between here and the moon, the light pollution from those is potentially bright enough to be equivalent to a full moon all the time at night for the entire world. So this affects not just human beings on the planet, but all the species that whose circadian rhythms, for instance, and breeding rhythms are affected by day and night cycles. So when you ask about ethical considerations, we very quickly balloon past the human race into questions about our responsibilities towards other species on this planet and the planet as a whole. And I'll just quickly give one other example, and that is I'm thinking of writing a story about an implementation of the theoretical sunshade that could be built to lower Earth's temperature and thus avoid the worst features or results of global warming. But in the timescales that we talk about building it, people will already have spent tens to hundreds of billions of dollars in adaptation to global warming. And everyone who is invested in those adaptations will find suddenly that all their work is for nothing if the temperature goes back down again. So they are stakeholders with a negative interest now in mitigating climate change. And what do we do if we have access to tools that can so drastically influence climate, and we have all of these extra stakeholders?
I love that. I mean, there's a reason this conversation is based at Said Business School, right? Because for human governance to work with at least in a modern sense, there's going to be commerce, and we need rules for commerce, and we need visionaries for commerce. And I would put that into one of the sets of the social sciences buckets that are needed to deal with these models. Ethics is another. What are some others? If you could make your fantasy small think tank of folks with whom to draw on expertise to tease out these scenarios, who would you want in the room who currently you wouldn't know who to call because the expertise in social sciences regarding space is not in the same level or volume as aerospace and engineering. And so I'm going to push you a little harder to tease out who would you want to draw on that currently you wouldn't know who to call.
Well, sorry.
No.
Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, there are a couple of guys actually who kind of already mentioned, and again, economist, ethicist in a way, but ethicist, I will really stress the point that would be able to value cost. Let's then pose the question of what is cost on an ethical point of view, because it's a key one, but indeed to try to come to measurements. And to me, this is very important. And this is what you see in impact investment, to always come back to an element of measure, otherwise you're not able to decide. Then, a couple of guys that we may not hear about, and again, this may be my bias from the cyber world, actually two types of guys. If you want to really push the thinking, if you had a couple of hackers that could help you, I mean, hackers in the intellectual sense of the word. That is, the problem with space is that we all have those mythological figures of like the big programs of the NASA and Soviet Union with super large rockets and so forth. But as we kind of said initially, it's a man-made space, and there are many different ways to use that new environment in a much cheaper way, to access that in a much cheaper way. There are also way more tons of activities for space that actually takes place on Earth. I mean, you have ground stations, you would have software, you would have cybersecurity for the software, you have people who would go into new business modeling, and then you would come with actually very small type of satellites and new type of very small launchers and so forth. So what I'm hinting at is that if you add a couple of additional hackers, you may actually expand the way to think about space, because the right thing with hackers is that they always go into non-traditional routes of thinking, and definitely not the established way we think about space with NASA and so forth. And maybe we'll find ways to exploit space in a totally original and imaginative way that we never thought of, and actually also low cost, which is a big advantage of hackers. And one last thing, sorry.
No, it's good.
Guys, I would also add to the conversation is military folks. Of course, for the aspect of defense reason that may happen with whatever you send up in space. Also because actually of new business model that could happen for the defense industry, because of lots of things that you can see on Earth from space, and just by way in parenthesis, the revolution of OSINT now, as seen a little bit in what's going on in Ukraine, that should bring some more ideas. But again, also in the way that you need to think about defending that environment, and when you have right military folks, how you can attack that environment, which is a way to then think about how you can defend it.
That's great. I think it's fair to consider defense in its own right, excuse me, in defense thinking and training and the community around it in its own right as a social sciences field.
Well,
Hang on.
yeah.
I'm just gonna throw out there other categories, and we'll come back to them, of historians and anthropologists and psychologists and environmentalists, folks who are involved in other aspects of what makes a livable environment human. Or an environment livable for humans. I'm going to move on to another question, though, just to keep building on this. And I'll start with you on this one, Karl. We've talked about this before, and it applies to both of you, about how imagination is not just a wonderful daydreaming and invention tool and human capability. It's actually a strategic asset. So I'd like you to comment on how imagination, not just narrative for explaining or marketing a point of view, but how we can utilize science fiction and world builders, gaming and otherwise, authors like yourself, into scenarios of these existential issues, right? Imagination as a strategic asset to urgently examine existential issues on a practical level, a planet-saving level, not just an entertainment or explaining level.
Sure. Well, there is right now a movement in science fiction known as Solarpunk, which is basically optimistic near future science fiction about solutions to climate issues. And I've written some. There's numerous other authors who have, such as Tobias Buckell. But I'm actually interested in a negative critique of science fiction and of the creativity involved in it. And I'll explain what I mean. I was at a Martian space development conference in Boston a couple of years back. And I somewhat antagonized the room I was in by sort of putting my hand up and asking why, when we see visions of space colonies, well, not the O'Neill colonies, but Martian colonies and spaceships, they all look like science fiction visions. In other words, they're metallic, they're shiny, there's nothing living in them. They are sterile environments. Why is this? I suggested that if I were to go to Mars, the first thing I would take would be a small greenhouse in which I could grow some bamboo and maybe an empress tree or something like that, harvest the wood, and I would wood panel my colony, and I would put wooden floors down, and I would make everything as natural as possible, because of the daunting nature of the inhospitability of the environment that you're in. We need as much contact with earthly and natural things as possible, but our imaginative structures that we've inherited from science fiction go the opposite way. They inspire us to think about sterile environments, plastic, and you see a lot of these visions in, say, Star Trek or in The Expanse, shows that provide us with perhaps one small glass thing that has a plant in it. Now, that's not what we want. That's not how our imaginations should run. So what I would like to see is a critique of how we have imagined space in science fiction all along, and perhaps go, now that we have access, in a new direction. Because the next step after imagination is design. And I don't want to see us designing what I'm seeing in science fiction movies and television shows.
I would agree with that. I think if we don't, by default, we have paramilitary or mining, the extension of mining monopolies as memes. So I'll pivot to you, Guy-Philippe. You write a very particular kind of fiction that is not precisely science fiction, and it is not precisely cyber defense fiction. You call it anticipatory fiction, and I'm interested in what you mean in that as a genre, but I'm even more interested in how that approach is a tool for, again, this hypothetical think tank table that I keep picturing with really interesting and unexpected people around the table. So
Sure.
what is anticipatory fiction, and how is it helpful in building capacity and resilience and those things?
Happy to explain. Just before that, just to say how much I agree with Karl, in the sense, as actually you summed up, Laura, that yes, too much of science fiction, which comes from, say, an old-style militaristic or a very basic sense of economies where the only thing we can exploit in space is mining. And it's really coming from, say, a certain type of perhaps demographics in terms of sci-fi writers. And anyway, and I agree that and science fiction, as you say, I'm not exactly science fiction, but I understand that it should be a realm of all possibilities and intersecting not only military first in space, but why not botanics in space, and why not nice gardens in space, and why not sex in space, and so forth. Going to your question in terms of what I try to write, so basically, I'm trying to do practical future thinking for mostly political, military decision makers. I mean, it ended up like this. And it's basically trying to understand, the environment of our societies, say, in the next 10, 20 years, even actually say even more than that, 20, 30 years from now, because the further you push forward, the more interesting it can be in terms of opening up whatever can happen. And then, going back to a sort of literature that existed in England, starting in England at the end of the 19th century, all this invasion literature, where you mix actually a new technology issue and then a new geopolitical issue. And voila, you try to understand what could be all the different issues. And indeed, you need to have some sort of passion for how bad things could turn, but always in a vraisemblable way. It is something of a technical, economical, societal, and geopolitical vraisemblance to that. And then explore the scenarios to see again how things could turn very, very bad. And then, because you're trying to write also entertaining fiction, and also because at the end of the day, you're not here to be a doomsayer, but to try to come up with a couple of solutions. And that's an interesting thing. Then, of course, you try to see if at the end someone can save the world. But the key thing is that, in a way, it's a little bit like design thinking, but for social or geopolitical mid to long-term problems. That is, you try to find what can be the problem, and then perhaps there's a solution.
Okay. All right. So all right. So I'm gonna go deeper of how can social sciences, and putting those hats on, even you as a writer, you put different hats on. You put your historian hat on. You put your governor of a colony hat on. How can social sciences today help moderate the nationalistic and concurrent military tone of space posturing and investment that we're seeing, right? We're seeing this exciting, frothy explosion of a commercial space sector, but we're also seeing boom, 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 space forces and what that could mean. How can social sciences, again, at the table, help moderate that tone for better frameworks for more options and better outcomes? Karl, you want to take it first?
Sure. Just in the realm of economics, I think we really need to recognize that we're dealing with a different kind of economic space with space. as Guy-Philippe says, it's an artificial construct in a lot of ways, and in some ways, it is a space of infinite resources. But all the signatories to the original UN treaty have agreed that no one owns anything in space, or no one owns the moon, no one owns Mars. You can take resources and use them and own them, but it's questionable whether you can own them while you are in space. And you can set up a colony on the moon, but it's questionable whether you can extend your national identity to that colony in any meaningful way. So militarization of space as an extension of earthly geopolitics doesn't really fit with either this vision of space or with the reality of the scales that we're dealing with, that are just simply off the charts compared to what we have here on Earth. So what we have is an opportunity to create an entirely new visions of economics with new kinds of economic actors and new kinds of economic and political and legal entities. And this is really what we come down to, is that we haven't inherited our economics, our politics, and our legal structures from what we had here on Earth. We are currently trying to extend them to the environment of space, but they don't quite fit. And so on every level, social, economic, political, legal, we have to rejig and reconfigure and reimagine and reinvent the entities that we're dealing with. Is the moon a person? Is the moon a country? Is the moon an extension of some earthly jurisdiction? Maybe none of these fit, right? This is, again, circling back to imagination, why we need imagination to proceed.
Guy-Philippe, what are some of the lessons and frameworks that we can use to think about space as an entity out here that we can draw on from cyber defense? Cyber defense is obviously a very interesting construct to think of. How can it help us get ready and build capacity for near space?
Well, I'll try to answer that question by answering also a little bit the previous question, because on that I may have a slightly different view from Karl, in the sense, but this is more like the cyber analyst that is talking here, in the sense that the militarization of space is an unfortunate, but I would say an inescapable fact of current world tensions between great powers. Mm-hmm. And you see that in space, you see that actually also undersea, you see that in the Arctic areas. It's, again, the fact that we're dealing with a man-made environment, and man-made environments are run by men, and men are organized into such entities or polities as great powers. And currently, great powers are moving into a confrontation. So I'm afraid this is a fact of, say, life that we cannot escape. Now, what we can take from cyber to try to avoid that the confrontation would be too directly taking place in space is, again, try to identify, as we try to do, for example, in that internet global commons that we have established, try to come up, can be through dialogue, it can be also through fictions, to mention the importance actually of maintaining that commons all together. Space of cooperation. We may accept that we have conflict and confrontation on many different domains, but perhaps we can mark that in those areas that still need developing and where there's lots of common commonalities, then it's much better to leave it as it is so far. And an additional thing that you can do, and I must say that this is an important thing of what you actually see today in cyber defense and actually in so-called cyber conflicts. I'll forget about cyber warfare terms, but it's the fact that there are scenarios that when you start waging war in certain domains, such as cyber, then there's a possibility that things could escalate very quickly, and thus that militaries on both sides could not control the confrontation. And I must say, I'm a little culprit into the development of that thinking, because my fiction, my debut novel on that was really mentioning the fact that cyber warfare could destabilize actually international relations, and it got a bit of reading among national security folks, say in France, a little bit in MIT at the end of the last decade, and also in Israel, actually back at the start of the 2010s. And of course, it's been part of a general discussion among cyber experts that perhaps there are many difficulties to really maintain escalation control in cyber. Now, this is interesting because in space, you may also have that same type of issue in terms of the escalation control may not be achievable, especially once you go into the issue of cascading space debris, like the whole Kessler syndrome. I don't know how effective or what are the probabilities that this could happen. But this is one of the scenarios, and this could be one of the reasons why we may kind of put a break into, okay, let's wage war in space, because after a bit of time, we may have all the space debris, and then actually lots of satellite communication on all sides may be broken. So this could be the type of ideas that actually can push forward by scenarios or imaginative or narratives. But let me tell you that in international relations, that's still a big place for lots of things that can be talked about, and perhaps this one could help stabilize a bit things. So these are a couple of examples.
Fantastic. I just want to take a second to call out to people on the various streams. Please put questions in the threads, and we will come around to them here fairly shortly. So I have a question for both of you, and I'll start with you, Karl. In a scenarios approach to even thinking about near space, do you have, how would you start to build resilience for extreme systems unknowns?
That's a very broad and very complex in a way question, but it's possible to give a simple sort of basic answer, which is you maximize accessibility from the ground for everything that you are doing in space. In other words, the complexity begins to be a problem, and systems begin to be a problem when they're autonomous, and obviously when they're complex, but particularly when they're autonomous. So if you have a colony on the moon that has a complex systems problem and you cannot get to it, that's a very different scenario from if you have a colony on the moon and you can literally put 1,000 tons of material there and 500 new people there in 2 days. So the interconnection with Earth and using Earth basically as a fin, an aileron, a stabilizing surface would be, my immediate solution.
Like it. Okay. Over to you, Guy-Philippe. Building resilience and capacity for the things we don't even, for the unknowns, getting ready for that hindline trip through the portal.
Very easy.
Okay.
No, I mean, there's one fantastic tool. Actually, there are two tools. One we've already mentioned, which is fiction, to try to see how problems could happen. And if you see them, before they happen, then maybe you can also think about the solution. And voila, you already have one way to try to mitigate your future crisis and to rebound in the crisis. Resilience comes from resiliare, the ability to rebound. So that's the key thing. Another tool beyond that, which is also something that I'm using and developing in cyber, but also somehow in military affairs, is simply games, simulations, sort of wargaming or serious games. What I would call prospective serious games in a very pompous way. And you're going, instead of playing out a scenario in the back of my mind, as a poor, lonely writer, sipping coffee over coffees, you actually have people to do that for you. You set up a scenario, and then you are going to have people with the right written up roles and functions, and really see the dynamics that could happen. Again,
but that goes to the heart of what I'm trying to tease out of you today is what roles are we missing, experienced or well-researched enough players for the roles, right? Who are the historians who we'd want at the table? It's that kind of thing. I don't mean to name names. I'm saying.
So if you'd be running a so-called serious game or sort of war game, you do a game, you need to have a balance between bringing the right people, but not necessarily bringing all the people, because at the end of the day, you need to play that game in, say, half a day or 2 days, but not for like 10 days, So it's really a question of the minimum viable number of people that you need to bring in terms of different type of population. So it kind of depends on the problems, but I'd say that you'd have all type of users, all type of operators, nation states, including the militaries, if ever you would have a problem. And then a representation, if you're talking about a commercial use of space, again, a representation of all the commercial operators, and then some of the additional stakeholders, that would be actually victims directly or indirectly of what would happen. So it does mean that you do need to think through a little bit of all the bad scenarios that could happen before you set up your war game, because you indeed need to pinpoint the right folks that are going to be touched by the issue. And then you set up the game. And most probably, if you've done it properly, you are going to end up with stuff you've never thought of.
Okay, I'm going to take an audience question here. David from the UK asked, which role can universities play to foster the dialogue between engineering and social sciences, and as well as the humanities? You want to start, Karl?
Well, how well do universities do right now at fostering a dialogue between engineering and the social sciences? I think there's a lot of work to be done on Earth before we can actually, create that relationship off-world or with regard to off-world. I think, in fact, that universities have to look beyond themselves to other communities, stakeholder communities that have solved that problem. And
who has solved that problem?
That's a very good question. If we're talking on the level of these disciplines as disciplines, I think we're looking at politicians. I think politics and embracing politics is incredibly important, and bringing in people who are good politicians in all of these disciplines. The tendency right now is to have one rule the other, and particularly in terms of technocracy. So if Elon Musk gets to Mars with his current system that he's building, it's very much a technocratic system. And how do we mitigate that? It's a very tough call. You have to do so by introducing entirely different kinds of communities, as Guy-Philippe suggests, different stakeholders. I would put monastic groups on Mars, for instance. Yeah. You need people who have a practical, immediate view of things, and then you need people who have a very, very long-term view, because it's the very long term that actually matters in this case. You need to set the colony up to run, but how does it function for 100, 500, 1,000 years? How much of that do you have to build in at the very beginning?
Yeah, well, you make a good circling back for me, which I appreciate. I'm less attempting today to come up with any ways to solve things. I am interested in the untapped capacity of different disciplines to be ready for this dialogue, right? So legal, I want to know the questions that law schools should be entertaining, right? The fact that Saeed has a Smart Space series at one of the world's preeminent business schools is a good start of it placing this dialogue. What questions, what cornerstone disciplines need to be starting to ask these questions, and to have a more complete perspective on quality of life and future governance. Go ahead, Guy-Philippe.
Yeah.
I can see the thought bubble.
Sure. Well, but just to go back to the question of universities and to add on that, I truly think that universities have excellent capabilities in terms of one key asset to solve that type of issues, that are young, smart people. I'm not saying that just to be sort of flattering, but I'm saying that, well, I could, but I'm saying that going back to the serious games or wargamings I was mentioning, to do one that would be successful, you need to actually, as we mentioned, set up the right roles and function, and there are elements of role playing here. Now, my own personal experience on that is that the more you take old folks that are not that much playful, okay, that they're much entrenched into their functions and expertise and so forth, you will not have very interesting games, because they are going to stick to their positions. But if you take people, who are still very smart, of course, so very agile in their thinking, that may have, engineering background or humanities background or legal background or business background, but, if projected into some sort of role playing, may perhaps actually capture some of the elements of how would, other type of roles would play, then, I truly believe that you may have interesting mix and interesting results. And by the way, universities are areas which to some extent are sandboxes. It's not like you do war games in a company or even in the military, then there's a lot of pressure of how people are going to actually succeed. Now, the interesting thing in such serious game is to see how errors are being made, not to see who's failing, but actually because you learn so much about errors. And again, universities as a sort of sandboxes may be quite the right area where that type of serious games or war games, where you could have indeed different views, going on play on the same situation, could be actually tested. So that's an idea.
I realize, and I know you bring your background with you, and you refer to it as this dynamic as war games, and I think that's the colloquial term for it. I would extend that, or I would encourage us to extend that into a broadened sort of scenarios thinking, and so scenarios in terms of conversation salons and dialogues like we're starting today, but also how a scenario's perspective and a role playing or gamification can be applied to things like climate crisis, right? So, I mean, one of the things that we haven't even touched on is what I call the concurrent systems challenges of the next 30 years, right? We've got climate change happening. It's happening. We have space, near space is happening. But we also have, and one of you touched on it a little earlier, I think, Karl, with autonomous systems and the exponential complexity and challenges of a set of autonomous complex systems, is the proliferation of AI and quantum computing in these mixes. And then the fourth would be the near-term potential of universal human connectivity. And therefore, the other side of connectivity, of course, is surveillance. So if we have 4 civilization level changing things, potential change that are happening at the same time, how do we frame scenarios?
Can I just
Yeah.
Can I just add that on top of that, I would really stress 2 other, global level changes, which are one I've already mentioned, geopolitical tensions. Let's not kid ourselves about that, because it's a big one. Okay. And it's going to frame space in very harsh terms. And another one, which somehow is linked a little bit also to other things you've said, but which is social inequalities or exploding social inequalities. Okay, just leave it at that. But again, don't forget it's a man-made environment, and those very social elements or geopolitical elements are going to hugely be at play in space.
Yeah, when I look at issues like this, I like to mash them all together and see if I can come up with a scenario or a system or a story in which all of these things are taken into account. And one of the things that interests me about space development is the idea of it as a commons and the economics of the commons. But when you start to combine, again, mash this in with other ideas, one of the things I play with in recent stories, for instance, in my short story, The Baker of Mars, is the idea of self-administering common pool resources. Artificial intelligence.
Can you say that?
Sure. Self-administering common pool resources. So a fishery, for instance, is a common pool resource. Things that we depend upon, but that don't have firm boundaries that we can fence in are typically common pool resources. And nearly everything in space is like that. There is a role for AI in representing parts of the system that we don't do well at representing ourselves in terms of governance. So there's a role for AI in space development of standing for the moon, standing for Martian resources, standing for asteroidal water, and all of these things. So just as an example of the kind of play that Guy-Philippe is talking about, is projecting forward and saying, well, what would that look like? What does it look like when you have AI systems in space that are aware of the governance issues that we have and that want to assist us with them? Do you get a different kind of economics? This is where, when you do an exercise like this, you really vividly start to see the failure of imagination that goes on with present visions of space development. Well, we'll have companies that go up there, or well, we'll have governments that go up there. Well, no, actually, society and life as a whole is going to go up there. It's going to be a lot more complex. And we need to imagine all the parts of it all at once, really.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the audience members points out that the ocean is a commons, and we have failed miserably at stewardship, or even really the maritime law is a very thin layer.
Yeah.
So there's the doing it better. Guy-Philippe, did you have a comment on the concurrent pieces and some thoughts on how to look at that?
I mean, just converging to what has been said, but and again stressing, I'm going to repeat myself here, but the political stressors, either inside nations or in the interrelations thing, are a huge stressor. That explains what we've seen already in below the surface, under the seas, the fight for cables, and now even Minister of Defense of France actually 2 months ago mentioned the need for some sort of militarization of underseas with small submarines that could go and either protect or perhaps attack cables. And again, space will not come from that, I believe, because in the past it was not different from that. Actually, it was one great era of great powers competition during the Cold War. And as we move back to some sort of Cold War, either with China or with Russia or with both, there's a high chance that indeed we find again those elements. Now, talking about fictions, and I give you my personal secret sauce, is that using geopolitical tensions is actually a very cheap but effective way to try to push forward all the problems that could happen. It's like using salt or too much sugar on any bad meal. Geopolitical stressors are the same ways, but it does help. It does help to think through, okay, if say China or Russia really wanted to hurt commercial development of Europe or of the US, in what smart and shrewd and perverse way they could act, and that makes you thinking that actually fire the so-called red team type of thinking that you may want to have, because the key thing here is, of course, not to become a very perverted, dangerous guy, that could happen, but to try to imagine the problems before they do happen again. And and that type of thinking is helpful. And again, as we discussed, you can start with scenarios, but then what's even better, because scenarios really is one guy playing in his head, is to have scenarios played out with other different type of guys, in games, for example.
So we have a question then from Kat at Purdue University. Do you think the TV series The Expanse, which I'm a self-avowed fangirl of, imagines the near future realistically?
No.
Okay. That's okay. Have you happened to watch it?
No, so I cannot answer that one.
Well, I can put a little more detail on that. It relies on a probably impossible space drive that allows you to break crystal cone trajectories at will anywhere in the solar system. It assumes resource limitations that simply don't exist as the drivers of the politics, and that's the big problem. The miners of Ceres are all hard done by. But why? Ceres has more water than the Earth. Everywhere you look up there, the resources are so large that there is absolutely no reason for any conflict between any of the players based upon resource considerations. So,
okay, yeah, but I'll push back on that. What about the in my talks, I often ask, whose vision of space do we want, right? The eccentric billionaires, any military, the scientists and engineers that are building cool things and solving hard problems, but maybe not looking at the consequences. and are we going to leave space to the mining and logistics companies? And I think of the Expanse as a fictional version of the possibility of mining and logistics companies basically running.
But what do you do with 16 billion tons of platinum? That's the question, right? So what do you do with 16 billion tons of aluminum? You have access to that kind of thing. The only person who's realistically, in my mind, explored these ideas is Gerard K. O'Neill. And his visions are so vast, according to what we're used to, that I don't think people can wrap their heads around them. We just don't talk about O'Neill anymore. And it's not because he was wrong, it's because we can't grasp that vision of the future, apparently.
So, all right. So here's a question for you as we come to a close. What are some of the blind spots about space that come to mind, or that you're concerned about? What question? I'll leave it at that. What are some blind spots?
Well, I'll tell you something in terms of blind spots, and going back to the question of large imaginative views of space. And to stress, again, I haven't seen The Expanse, but the most famous space opera that we know of is Star Wars. And I had this discussion with a guy actually today about it, stressing that so much of the vision of Star Wars, and here I'll stick it to just the military elements of Star Wars, is actually full-time World War II movies and nothing else. You have so much dogfights in Star Wars. Now, funny thing, with current platforms such as the F-35, there will never be any types of dogfights. This is over. Some military analysts say the last dogfights is what happened during the Iran-Iraq war, back 35 years ago. So I'm always struck by, to some extent, how we think about space, how old style and cliché and passé it often is. I'm surprised that space is actually an environment fully composed of mostly robots and nothing else. That will do stuff for us staying, on the largest spaceship that we have. And I'm not sure that we'll have anyone in the near future, which is Earth. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is an interesting thing, especially in terms of new space. But, who really talks about that? I mean, like new space, the robotic developments for communications, and also a little bit of mining, who knows, but.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So keep going with blind spots.
Well, for me, scale and time. The Trojan asteroids of Jupiter orbit in a space that is as large as the entire inner solar system. Right? Once we get out there, the scales are off the charts, and we do not have a framework for thinking about those scales. Geopolitics just shrinks down to insignificance compared with the sheer amount, again, billions and billions of trillions of tons of any resource that you might want. What's the basis of conflict in circumstances like that? We don't really understand that. Conflict on Earth, sure, but conflict driven by space resource, that's a lot harder to imagine.
Well, that could be quite dangerous. You mentioned historians. When Spain and Portugal discovered the New World, all of a sudden they had, at their hands, vast expanses of new resources and gold, or so they thought, all over the place. But actually what it led to was a huge rise in inflation in Spain. So going back to the question of Laura in terms of who do we need, sometimes historians, indeed, that can bring back stories from the past as potential metaphors or scenarios that then need to be reactualized, and then economists, that could be interesting, for example, to think about future space.
Yeah.
As forecast at the beginning of this, it's just the start of a conversation. And here at the Smart Space series, what we're here to do is to start the conversation and to encourage it to continue. It is a global and urgent conversation, I believe. And thank you to both so much for playing with me today and starting that. I really deeply appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Karl.